Late summer 2025, northeast Georgia. A mud dauber wasp hovers in front of a golden web the size of a dinner table, and at the centre of that web sits something that has no business being in America. The spider is palm-sized, electric yellow and blue-black, with a leg span pushing 4 inches. For a decade, nothing on this continent knew how to kill it. Then, in August 2025, a university research team filmed what happened next. The wasp struck, the spider lost, and the footage changed everything scientists thought they understood about this invasion. That's not what was supposed to happen. For 12 years, the Joro spider had been spreading across the American South, with almost nothing standing in its way. No meaningful predators, no population ceiling anyone could identify. Just web after web after web, blanketing tree lines and power poles from Georgia to the Carolinas. The assumption, quietly held by most researchers, was that this thing had slipped through a gap in nature that might never close. But something changed, and scientists are still not entirely sure what. What does it mean when an invasive species, one that rewrote the ecological rules of an entire region, suddenly starts losing? Is this the beginning of a natural correction, or just a single wasp getting lucky on camera? That question is what this story is actually about. The spider at the centre of all of this is Trichonephila clavata, and the female is the only version of this animal that matters ecologically or visually. Males are tiny, drab, and largely irrelevant to the story. The female is the story. Her body alone can reach a full inch in length, and with legs extended she spans up to 4 inches across, roughly the size of an adult human palm. The colouring is unmistakable, vivid yellow banding, blue-black legs, and red markings beneath that make her look less like a spider and more like a warning label printed by evolution itself. Her web is an engineering achievement. It is not a flat disc. It is layered, three-dimensional, architecturally complex, and strong enough that in her native range across East Asia, large webs have been documented snaring small birds. The silk itself has a golden tint in direct sunlight, not metaphorically golden, but literally visibly yellow, the result of a specific protein composition that researchers are still working to fully understand. In Georgia, she builds these structures across hiking trails, between parked cars, across front porches. Every August, as webs peak in size and density, local media runs the same annual panic cycle. Residents film them from their driveways, holding phones at arm's length. The footage goes viral. Scientists spend weeks answering the same phone calls from the same nervous homeowners. But underneath the spectacle, something genuinely important is happening in the canopy and brush lines of the American Southeast, something that the annual media panic almost always misses. This spider has been spreading for over a decade, with almost nothing to stop it. Until, apparently, something did. How an animal with no natural enemies on an entire continent suddenly started showing up as prey, filmed, documented and replicated, is a question that cuts to the core of how invasions actually end, or whether they end at all. Nobody was paying attention to Joro spiders back then. They were an obscure orb weaver from East Asia, catalogued in the scientific literature, known to arachnologists who specialised in the region, and essentially invisible to everyone else. That was about to change. To understand how the Joro spider arrived in North America, you have to go back to its home range, the forests and rice paddies and suburban gardens of Japan, China, Korea and Taiwan. There, Trichonephila clavata exists inside a system that has been calibrated over millions of years. Parasitic wasps lay eggs inside its body. Predatory birds have learned the geometry of its webs. Competing spiders push it out of prime territory. The Joro, in its native range, is not dominant. It is managed. It is one thread in a fabric that holds everything in tension. That balance is not visible unless you know to look for it. And for a spider crossing an ocean, it would not travel with it. Picture the port of Savannah, Georgia. sometime around 2013. It is one of the busiest container ports on the eastern seaboard, processing millions of shipping containers every year, moving goods from Asia to the American interior and back again. A container arrives from Japan or China or Korea. Inside, packed among whatever cargo it carries, electronics, textiles, machine parts, there are almost certainly egg sacs. Tiny, papery, the size of a thumbnail, each one holding hundreds of spiderlings, dormant, waiting. The container is unloaded. The sack is overlooked. A dock worker walks past it without a second glance. And somewhere in the industrial landscape east of Atlanta, the eggs hatch. This is the leading theory for how the Joro arrived. Not a deliberate introduction. Not a research experiment gone wrong. No single person to blame. No single moment of carelessness to point to. The spider simply exploited the infrastructure of global trade the same way hundreds of invasive species have before it. Quietly, accidentally, and with devastating efficiency. By 2013 to 2014, researchers at the University of Georgia had recorded the first confirmed sightings of Trichonephila clavata in the United States, in the northeastern corner of Georgia, not far from the greater Atlanta metropolitan area. The specimens were photographed, identified, and logged. They were, at the time, treated as a curiosity. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense. Because the spider did not stay in Georgia, and it did not spread only by crawling or by hitching rides in cars or by following the slow creep of landscaping plants moving from nursery to nursery. It spread on the wind. The Joro spider, like many orb weavers, uses a behavior called ballooning, a technique so improbable it sounds invented. Spiderlings, freshly hatched and barely a millimetre long, climb to an elevated point, aim their spinnerets skyward, and release a thread of silk into the air. The thread catches a thermal, an updraft, a breeze, and the spiderling goes with it, carried aloft, passive, weightless, travelling on currents of air that can move them dozens or even hundreds of miles from where they started. Read that again. A spider the size of a sesame seed, releasing a silk thread, riding the wind for hundreds of miles. It is not a metaphor. It is a documented biological mechanism observed in dozens of species, and in the Joro it appears to be particularly effective. Researchers have found that Joro spiderlings are unusually tolerant of cold temperatures during the ballooning phase, which means they can stay aloft in conditions that would ground other species. They can cross mountain ridges. They can drift over rivers. They can land in a suburban backyard 3 states away from where they hatched, and, if conditions are right, survive. And conditions in the American Southeast are very right. The climate of northern Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Virginia closely mirrors the temperate, humid summers of central Japan. Warm, wet, long-growing seasons, abundant insects, plenty of structures to anchor a web, fences, power lines, the eaves of houses, the shrubs along a driveway. The Joro did not arrive in hostile territory. It arrived in a landscape that felt, in almost every ecological sense, like home. Except for one critical difference. There were no parasitic wasps waiting for its egg sacs. There were no birds that had learned to avoid the golden silk. There were no competitors that had evolved alongside it for millennia. The Joro stepped into a continent-sized vacancy and found nothing pushing back. The early detections were scattered. A report from one county. A photograph from a homeowner in another. Scientists at UGA began tracking the reports, but in those first years the numbers were small enough that the scale of what was coming was not yet legible. No one was raising alarms. No one was convening emergency meetings. The Joro was a strange and beautiful spider that had somehow appeared in Georgia. And that was interesting. And that was essentially where the conversation stopped. Nobody celebrated exactly, but nobody worried either. Scientists noted the presence, filed the records, and moved on to other things. They shouldn't have. Because while the reports were being filed and the specimens were being photographed, something else was happening in the yards and tree lines and power line corridors of North Georgia. The spiders were not just surviving, they were building. Quietly, season by season, web by web. The population was establishing itself in the gaps of an ecosystem that had no idea what was coming. Those first overlooked egg sacs would come back to haunt the region. But that's getting ahead of the story. Picture a subdivision on the outskirts of Gainesville, Georgia, in the autumn of 2020. The houses are set back from the road behind mature oak trees and ornamental shrubs. The power lines run along the back edge of the properties, strung between wooden poles, and between those poles, in the space that most people pass without looking, there are webs. Not one or two. Dozens. Some of them spanning 4 feet across, catching the low October light and turning it gold. At the centre of each web, a Joro spider sits motionless, legs spread, her body the size of a human thumb. Drive slowly enough down the right street in Hall County that fall, and you will see them on every block, on every fence, in every gap between the eaves and the hedges. The Joro spider has not merely arrived in Georgia. It has saturated it. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. By 2020, researchers tracking the Joro's expansion had confirmed established populations across most of the state of Georgia, with the densest concentrations in the northeastern counties around Athens and Gainesville, the same region where the first sightings had been recorded just 6 or 7 years earlier. From a handful of confirmed specimens in 2013 and 2014, the population had grown to the point where citizen science platforms like iNaturalist were receiving hundreds of reports per season. The spider was no longer a curiosity. It was a fixture, and it was moving. South Carolina reported confirmed Joro populations by 2020. North Carolina followed. The northward march along the eastern seaboard was accelerating in a way that surprised even the researchers who had been watching it most closely. Dr. Nancy Hinkle at the University of Georgia, one of the scientists who had been tracking population reports since the early years, noted that density increases in core Georgia populations through 2022 were not linear. They were exponential. The spider was not spreading like a slow tide. It was spreading like a wave that kept gaining height. To understand why, you have to understand what the suburban and exurban American landscape looks like from a Joro spider's perspective. It is, in almost every measurable way, ideal habitat. Power lines provide elevated anchoring points that no forest canopy can match, long, horizontal, perfectly tensioned, running for miles without interruption. The eaves of houses create protected corners where a web can survive rain and wind. Ornamental shrubs provide the low vegetation that harbours the insects a Joro needs to feed on. Suburban lawns, with their manicured edges and their abundance of flying insects in the warm months, are effectively a buffet table set for an orb weaver. And the American Southeast, with its long growing season stretching from April through November in some areas, gives the Joro enough time to reach full maturity, reproduce, and lay egg sacs before the first hard frost arrives. Compare that to the spider's native range. In Japan, Trichonephila clavata occupies similar suburban and semi-rural landscapes, but it does so under constant biological pressure. Parasitoid wasps of the genus Bios and others target its egg sacs. Predatory birds have learned to associate the golden web with a meal. The spider survives, but it is kept in check. In Georgia, in South Carolina, in the spreading edge populations pushing into Tennessee and Virginia, none of that pressure exists. The Joro arrived with all of its reproductive capacity intact and none of the biological debt that keeps it manageable at home. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. There is no regulatory framework that anticipated this. There is no agency that monitors the accidental introduction of spider species via shipping containers. The Joro arrived through a gap in the system that is not a gap anyone designed. It is simply a gap that exists because the volume of global trade is so enormous and the number of potential stowaways so vast that comprehensive screening is practically impossible. The spider did not break any law. It did not overcome any barrier that was designed to stop it. It walked through a door that was already open. By 2024, confirmed Joro populations had been documented in Tennessee, Virginia, and Maryland. Researchers began discussing whether the spider's thermal tolerance, that same cold hardiness that makes its spiderlings such effective balloonists, might allow it to establish populations as far north as New England. The models were not reassuring. The Joro's native range in Japan extends into regions with cold winters, and laboratory studies suggested it could survive temperatures that would kill most competing orb weavers in the American Northeast. The northern limit of its eventual range was not yet known. It might still not be known. The exponential density increases that Dr. Hinkle and her colleagues were tracking in Georgia through 2022 told a particular kind of story. In invasion biology, there is a phase called the establishment lag, the period between when a species first arrives and when its population begins to grow rapidly. The Joro's lag phase appears to have been very short, perhaps 4 or 5 years from first confirmed sighting to the beginning of exponential growth. That is fast. Fast enough that by the time most people in Georgia had noticed the spiders, the population was already beyond any realistic point of containment. Everything was in place. The Joro spider just didn't know what everything was building toward. Because somewhere in those dense webs strung between the power lines of North Georgia, in those autumn afternoons when the light turned the silk gold and the spiders sat fat and motionless at the centre of their territories, something else was watching. Something that had not been there the year before. Something that the models had not predicted and the population curves had not accounted for. The predator gap, it turned out, might not be as permanent as everyone assumed. Picture a kudzu vine in August. Not a single vine, a wall of them. Green so thick it swallows telephone poles whole, buries fence lines, pulls down the crowns of 60-year-old oaks until the trees simply disappear beneath the surface. You drive through rural Georgia or Tennessee or the Carolinas, and the landscape looks like something draped a green tarp over the world and forgot to come back. Kudzu arrived from Japan in 1876, introduced at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition as an ornamental curiosity. By the late 1990s, it covered an estimated 7 million acres across the American Southeast. 7 million. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. And for decades, ecologists could not fully explain why it spread so catastrophically here when it behaved so modestly back home in Japan. The answer, it turned out, was embarrassingly simple. In Japan, kudzu has enemies. It has a whole community of insects, fungi, and grazing animals that have spent thousands of years learning how to eat it, weaken it, slow it down. They are not dramatic predators. They are persistent ones. A fungal pathogen here, a beetle larva there, a deer that has learned through generations of trial that kudzu leaves are worth stopping for. None of those enemies made the crossing with the vine, and so kudzu arrived in America carrying none of its historical burden. It stepped into a blank ecological slate and ran. Ecologists have a name for this: the enemy release hypothesis. The core idea is straightforward. Invasive species succeed not necessarily because they are stronger or faster or more adaptable than native species, but because they left their co-evolved enemies behind. Predators, parasites, pathogens, the whole invisible machinery of mortality that keeps a population in check at home. Cross an ocean, and that machinery stays on the other side of the water. The invader doesn't become more powerful, it just becomes unburdened. And this is the part where things stop being funny. Because when you map that framework onto the Joro spider, the picture that emerges is not a quirky news story about a big yellow spider making people scream on their porches. It is a population expanding in a landscape that has no idea what it is. In Japan, Trichonephala clavata is not an unchecked animal. It faces a suite of co-evolved pressures that have tracked it across millennia. Certain wasp species have learned to hunt it specifically, targeting egg sacs with precision honed over thousands of generations. Parasitoid flies deposit their eggs directly onto the spider's body, and the larvae develop by consuming the host from the inside out, slowly, invisibly, a death that takes days. Birds in its native range have developed search images for those enormous golden webs. They know what the silhouette means. They know there is a meal at the centre of it. These are not generalist pressures. They are specialised relationships, built slowly, tested continuously, refined across deep time. None of those relationships exist in Georgia. The parasitoid flies that target Joro spiders in Japan are not present in the American Southeast. The wasps that raid their egg sacs have no counterpart here with the same learned behaviour. Native birds encounter the webs, but a bird that has never encountered Trichonephala clavata before has no inherited search image for it, no instilled preference, no behavioural shortcut that says this particular spider in this particular web is worth the energy it takes to catch. Learning takes time. Populations don't wait. By 2014, when the first confirmed Joro populations were documented in Jackson County, Georgia, the spiders were already operating inside that gap. The mortality pressure that would have trimmed their numbers in Kyushu simply wasn't being applied. Egg sacs that would have been parasitized in Japan hatched undisturbed. Juveniles that would have been picked off by specialized hunters ballooned out on the wind and landed in new counties without a single co-evolved enemy waiting for them. By 2022, researchers tracking the spread estimated Joro populations across portions of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, numbering in the hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions of individuals in a landscape that had known them for less than a decade. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. Because the enemy release hypothesis is not a permanent condition. It is a window. A gap that opens when an invasive species first arrives and closes, sometimes slowly, sometimes faster than anyone expected, as native species begin to respond. Kudzu, for all its dominance, is now being targeted by a USDA-approved biological control agent. Burmese pythons in the Everglades, which spent years expanding with almost no natural predators to slow them, are now being hunted by trained removal teams, and increasingly by American alligators that have begun to recognize them as prey. The gap closes. The question is always how wide it opens first, and how much damage accumulates while it is open. Which brings us back to Georgia. Back to those webs in the oak canopy, 3 meters wide, catching the October light. Back to the population curves that had been climbing without interruption since 2014. And back to whatever it was that the researchers filming Joro populations in 2023 noticed moving through those webs. Something native, something that had not been documented targeting Joro spiders before, something that suggested the blank slate was not going to stay blank forever. But this wasn't just about the spiders anymore, because what the Joro eats, and what eats the Joro, has consequences that ripple out into Georgia's farms, its forests, and its already stressed community of native orb weavers trying to hold their ground. Go back to the beginning for a moment, back to that web in the cold morning light, the golden silk catching the frost, the enormous spider at the centre of it absolutely still, and in the web, struggling, a brown, marmorated stink bug, legs tangled in silk, not going anywhere. That detail matters more than it first appeared. The brown, marmorated stink bug is not a native insect. It arrived from Asia in the late 1990s, probably as a stowaway in shipping containers, and it has since become one of the most economically damaging agricultural pests in the eastern United States. It feeds on apples, peaches, soybeans, corn. It is difficult to control chemically without harming beneficial insects. It overwinters inside homes by the thousands, squeezing through gaps in window frames and siding, filling wall cavities until the walls themselves seem to hum. The southeast has struggled with it for years, and the Joro spider catches it readily. The geometry of a Joro web, large, three-dimensional, strung high in the canopy, is well suited to intercepting flying insects, and the stink bug flies. Studies examining web contents have found stink bugs among the prey. The Georgia Department of Agriculture has noted the possibility of incidental pest control benefit, though researchers are careful with the language. The scale is unquantified. One spider eating one stink bug is not an agricultural solution, but hundreds of millions of spiders across millions of acres eating stink bugs continuously through the fall. That is a variable worth watching. The venom is not the story people want it to be. Joro spiders are venomous in the technical sense. All spiders are, but the fangs are small. The venom is medically insignificant to humans, and there are no documented serious bites in the United States. They do not chase. They do not aggress. They sit in their webs and they wait. A researcher at UGA described handling them during field surveys as unremarkable. The spider retreats, vibrates its web as a warning, and does nothing further. It is, she said, far less interested in you than you are in it. The legitimate ecological concern is quieter than fear of bites. It is competition. Native orb weavers, the garden spiders, the writing spiders, the species that have occupied this niche for thousands of years, may find themselves competing with Joro for web space and for the flying insects those webs intercept. In areas of peak Joro density, field surveys have recorded measurable reductions in the number of native orby weaver webs within the same corridor. Whether that pressure is meaningful at the population level is still being studied, but the early signal is not nothing. What the Joro actually does then is complicated. It is not a monster. It is not a saviour. It is an animal doing what animals do, eating, reproducing, filling available space in a landscape that did not build itself around it. That tension is worth sitting with. An invasive pest eating another invasive pest, inside an ecosystem still trying to figure out what it has become. And now, finally, something native pushing back. A mud dauber wasp hovering at the edge of a golden web. A spider that has spent a decade unchallenged suddenly facing a predator that did not read the script. The wasp strikes. The spider loses. The camera keeps rolling. The reckoning, it turns out, does not always arrive from the direction anyone was watching. Somewhere in Georgia, a web that was there last year is gone. Subscribe to catch the next comeback story before it disappears too.